It was destined to become the most jubilant day of her tender existence. June 13th, 2009. A suffocating Saturday afternoon beneath the oppressive Tennessee humidity in Maple Hollow. The archetypal diminutive southern hamlet, where residents recognized neighboring offspring by their given names, where celebratory gatherings spilled organically from manicured backyards onto weathered driveways. 8-year-old Lila Hartley had meticulously counted down the hours to this moment for endless weeks. Fuchsia balloons, tethered to the cedar fence, oscillated rhythmically in the tepid summer zephyr. A charcoal grill sputtered and expelled aromatic smoke, while the euphoric cacophony of children's merriment reverberated down the tranquil residential corridor. Within the photographs captured that afternoon, the identical frames law enforcement would subsequently scrutinize with obsessive precision, Lila occupied the gravitational center of the festivities, a diminutive figure adorned with chestnut-hued hair, freckles scattered like constellations across her cheekbones, draped in a rose-colored cotton dress that harmonized perfectly with the sugary frosting cascading down her confection. Her maternal figure, Dana, had commissioned the cake from an established local patisserie. The oppressive heat had already begun compromising its structural integrity by the moment flickering candles pierced its surface. Neighbors recollect the manner in which Lila squinted against the merciless solar glare while formulating her silent wish. Someone had remarked, half joking through the afternoon haze, "Don't divulge it to anyone, or it'll never materialize." By 4 p.m., the symphony of celebration and laughter continued saturating the yard, adults congregating near the smoldering grill, children weaving chaotically between an oscillating sprinkler and a creaking swing set. Nothing registered as aberrant, yet somewhere within the interstices between games and cleanup, between an overturned beverage and a liberated balloon, Lila Hartley evaporated into nothingness. Nobody registered her absence initially. Gatherings of this magnitude possessed an inherent pandemonium, youngsters migrating fluidly between adjacent properties, parents distracted by superficial conversation. When Dana summoned the children collectively to unveil presents, Lila remained conspicuously absent from their ranks. Her companions presumed she'd ventured indoors, seeking hydration, or perhaps lingered in the frontal yard. A neighboring resident volunteered to investigate the lavatory. Another soul examined the lateral yard, anticipating discovering her positioned beside the fence, pursuing a butterfly with her characteristic wonder. Within 10 agonizing minutes, that nebulous confusion began its metamorphosis into something substantially more ominous, that gradual suffocating cognizance that reality had fractured irreparably. Dana vocalized her daughter's name once, twice, subsequently, again with escalating desperation. The ambient chatter dissipated into nothingness. The melodic wind chimes and the hypnotic drone of cicadas consumed the vacuum. Attendees commenced wandering in expanding concentric circles, projecting Layla. Down the pavement, their voices ascending in pitch and mounting urgency. By 4:30, Dana trembled violently as she traversed the residence, systematically accessing every portal, investigating closets, the garage, even the washer and dryer units, as though she might discover her precious child concealed somewhere, giggling, perpetuating an elaborate game that had transcended acceptable boundaries. But Lila had vanished. When the inaugural patrol vehicle materialized shortly after 5 p.m., the atmospheric tension had transformed entirely. The thoroughfare now teemed with distressed neighbors, parents clutching their offspring protectively. One uniformed officer initiated questioning guests, while another navigated through the yard, demanding silence to facilitate the search canine's operation. The dogs circulated near the flagstone patio, investigated Lila's footwear from within the dwelling, then gravitated toward the rear fence, a 6-foot cedar barricade demarcating the Cole family's territory. Then, positioned just beyond its perimeter, they froze. The scent trajectory terminated abruptly. That constituted the inaugural anomaly detectives documented. Even if a child had wandered astray, the canines should have maintained her trail for at minimum several hundred yards toward the arterial road, into an adjacent lot, or penetrating the woods flanking the subdivision. Yet it manifested as though Lila had dissolved into the atmospheric ether. By nightfall's arrival, Maple Hollow swarmed with civilian volunteers. Flashlight beams penetrated the encroaching darkness as coordinated groups dispersed across lawns and wooded patches, vocally projecting her name into the void. Helicopters dispatched from the county sheriff's aviation division hovered overhead, rotors slicing through humid air. Journalists assembled near the cul-de-sac entrance, transmitting live updates to audiences statewide. Within 12 unrelenting hours, the narrative had infiltrated every household across Tennessee. 8-year-old girl vanished from birthday celebration in Maple Hollow. Inside the Hartley residence, detectives conducted segregated interviews with family constituents. Lila's paternal figure, Tom, sat rigidly within the kitchen, complexion drained of color, mechanically addressing identical interrogations repeatedly. Who attended the gathering? What temporal moment she was last observed? Whether any unfamiliar individuals had recently relocated into the vicinity? He maintained everyone present constituted family or intimate acquaintances. Everyone except a solitary individual, the neighbor residing across the thoroughfare. Richard Cole, who had materialized that morning offering assistance, establishing tables, and delivering supplementary refrigerated provisions. Cole inhabited his residence in solitude. He'd existed there for considerable years, predominantly maintaining distance. At that juncture, nobody harbored suspicions regarding his involvement. He'd conversed casually with guests, appeared in several photographs, subsequently departed before midday meal. Nevertheless, detectives inscribed his name within their documentation. By dawn's emergence the subsequent morning, search teams had methodically examined every microscopic portion of Maple Hollow. They systematically drained a neighboring retention pond, swept drainage ditches, navigated through culverts on hands and knees. Not a solitary trace materialized. No footprint impressions, no textile fibers, no garments, no biological evidence. That Sunday, the Hartleys positioned themselves on their frontal lawn, enveloped by camera equipment. Dana implored anyone possessing information to materialize, her voice fracturing, the exhaustion and disbelief etched permanently across her features. Behind her silhouette, the rose-colored decorations from the celebration remained, suspended, faded, undulating in the humid wind currents. As hours transmuted into days, the investigation expanded exponentially. Law enforcement examined every registered vehicle that had traversed the neighborhood that afternoon. They acquired surveillance footage from commercial establishments, refueling stations, traffic signal installations. Hundreds of tips inundated communication channels. Alleged sightings, theories, leads that dissipated into nothingness. Each day, the search perimeter widened incrementally, yet the results remained uniform. Nothing. The more prolonged Lila's absence extended, the more desperate the township became. Flyers emblazoned with her school photograph, captured mere weeks prior, blanketed telephone poles, grocery store windows, automobile windshields. Religious institutions convened prayer vigils. Complete strangers deposited stuffed animals at the foundation of the Hartleys' mailbox. Meanwhile, detectives began questioning the logistics. How could a child dissolve into nothingness during broad daylight from a yard saturated with witnesses? They scrutinized photographs and home video recordings from the gathering frame by painstaking frame, analyzing background faces, shadows, even reflections manifesting in automobile windows. They documented one particular detail in the final known photograph of Lila, captured mere moments before she vanished. She stood positioned near the rear fence, her balloon string coiled around her wrist, gazing skyward. It was a suspended moment, crystallized in time, one that investigators would subsequently revisit obsessively. That evening, as the second day drew to its conclusion, search crews were withdrawn. The chief investigator addressed assembled media representatives, his words weighted with unspoken dread. At this temporal moment, we are processing this as simultaneously a missing person case and a potential abduction scenario. Behind those carefully calibrated words lay a silent admission. They no longer maintained belief that Lila had simply wandered astray. In the subsequent days, Maple Hollow underwent a complete metamorphosis, a community seized by fear and corrosive suspicion. Parents escorted their children to educational institutions rather than permitting bus transportation. Neighbors secured their entry points before sunset's arrival. The tranquil cul-de-sac where Lila had existed was now demarcated with police barrier tape and satellite transmission trucks. Detectives operated relentlessly around the clock, yet every promising lead disintegrated upon examination. Witness testimonies contradicted one another with disturbing frequency. Timelines overlapped impossibly. One neighbor adamantly claimed observing a white van positioned near the corner that afternoon, yet traffic surveillance cameras documented no such vehicle. Another insisted she detected crying emanating from the woods around sunset, yet search canines discovered nothing in that location either. By the termination of the inaugural week, hope was deteriorating rapidly. Detectives commenced re-interviewing guests, scrutinizing for inconsistencies, anything that might have been overlooked initially. One investigator subsequently recalled how during those interrogations there existed one individual who seemed disturbingly detached, polite, cooperative, yet maintaining a composure that didn't correspond with the surrounding chaos. It was Richard Cole, the neighbor across the thoroughfare. At that temporal moment, nobody applied excessive pressure. He wasn't documented as the final person to observe Lila, and zero physical evidence connected him to the disappearance. Nevertheless, his name remained inscribed within the case documentation, circled in pencil. As weeks transmuted into months, the media frenzy gradually subsided. Alternative narratives displaced Lila's in the headlines. But within Maple Hollow, the absence lingered like an infected wound. Dana ceased sleeping in her own bedroom, excessively haunted by the visual of the backyard. Tom returned to occupational responsibilities, but colleagues remarked he was barely present spiritually. The balloons, long deflated, remained tethered to the fence post until atmospheric currents tore them away. For a township like Maple Hollow, the disappearance of a child wasn't merely a criminal act. It was a wound that refused cicatrization, and for the Hartleys, it was the commencement of a nightmare that would extend across 15 interminable years. Because what nobody could have comprehended then, not the detectives, not the reporters, not even Dana herself, was that the solution to what transpired with her daughter wasn't buried in the woods or concealed by a stranger miles distant. It was waiting precisely there in the identical neighborhood, just across the thoroughfare. But here's what nobody tells you about the truth. Sometimes it doesn't set you free. Sometimes it just confirms the nightmare was real all along. In the days that followed Lila Hartley's evaporation, Maple Hollow felt as though it had ceased respiration. Patrol vehicles continued lining the thoroughfare. Officers methodically combed through brush flanking the creek, and neighbors congregated on porches, exchanging theories in hushed tones. The Hartleys' backyard, once saturated with laughter, balloons, and the euphoric acoustics of children's games, had metamorphosed into a cordoned crime scene. Every blade of vegetation photographed, every footprint impression meticulously measured. Detectives from the county's Missing Persons Division operated with methodical precision. They commenced by interrogating every individual who had attended the celebration. Parents, children, relatives. Each was questioned multiple times, their statements compared and cross-referenced with obsessive attention. Timelines were reconstructed minute by excruciating minute. Detectives logged vehicle registration plates from security surveillance at the primary road penetrating into the subdivision. Nothing registered as anomalous. Nobody had witnessed a struggle, an unfamiliar vehicle, or anyone departing with suspicious haste. It manifested as though Lila had simply ceased existing, somewhere between her backyard and the fence perimeter. Attention eventually gravitated toward the residence across the thoroughfare. The domicile of Richard Cole, a 42-year-old maintenance technician who inhabited the space in solitude following a recent divorce. He'd maintained friendly relations with the Hartleys, occasionally assisting Dana with landscaping maintenance or retrieving their refuse receptacles on collection days. He'd been present that morning, volunteering to assist establishing folding chairs before the celebration commenced, but multiple witnesses recalled observing him depart around midday, and he insisted he'd expended the remainder of the afternoon executing errands and consuming television programming. Detectives requested to examine his automobile, a beige sedan with deteriorating tires and a fractured windshield. They dusted it for fingerprints, deployed cadaver dogs around the perimeter, inspected his garage and subterranean space. Nothing incriminating materialized. He seemed anxious, but then again, most individuals were, when law enforcement came knocking. His alibi wasn't flawless, but it wasn't incorrect either. Surveillance from a refueling station down the road documented him purchasing cigarettes, proximate to the temporal moment the party concluded. Still, something about him persisted in the recesses of investigators' consciousness. Excessively calm, excessively cooperative. His tone detached as though the gravity of the circumstances hadn't genuinely penetrated. But absent physical evidence, suspicion could only extend so far. The focus pivoted again, this temporal juncture inward toward the family. Statistically, investigators comprehended that in cases involving missing children, the perpetrator was frequently someone within the household. They commenced dissecting the Hartleys' marriage, their financial records, their telephone communications. The once sympathetic police presence became invasive. Detectives questioned why Dana had waited nearly 15 minutes before contacting emergency services. They scrutinized her tone during interrogations, her gestures, her tears. To them, grief could sometimes camouflage culpability. Tom, the paternal figure, became the subsequent target of quiet speculation. He'd been positioned outside at the grill when Lila disappeared, conversing with a neighbor about automotive repairs. But there existed inconsistencies in his timeline, 2 moments when nobody could verify his location. He grew defensive, enraged at repeated questioning. "You believe I'd harm my daughter?" he reportedly told one detective. But frustration only fueled the rumors. As days transmuted to weeks, the narrative began splintering under the pressure of media coverage. Local reporters executed nightly updates, their headlines becoming increasingly dramatic with each passing day. "Family secrets in Maple Hollow," one proclaimed. Another tabloid suggested a custody plot gone catastrophically wrong. Television transmission trucks parked along the thoroughfare. Strangers walked past the residence, capturing photographs. Dana ceased departing the house altogether. Theories multiplied like viruses. Some maintained belief a traveling predator had traversed through town and identified an opportunity. Others whispered about a relative with a criminal record. A few clung to the notion that Lila had been taken by someone she knew and might still be alive somewhere, kept concealed. But every lead transmuted into another dead end. The toll on the Hartley family was devastating. The public scrutiny became unbearable. Online forums dissected their interviews, their facial expressions, even the garments they wore at press conferences. When a national talk show host implied that a mother always knows, Dana collapsed on her kitchen floor, sobbing. Tom's anger hardened into silence. He ceased cooperating with police after they executed a search warrant on his truck. Their marriage, already strained by sleepless nights and the constant hum of suspicion, began fracturing. The house itself underwent transformation. The backyard, once verdant and lively, grew overgrown with invasive vegetation. The rose-colored swing set was dismantled and stored in the garage. Lila's bedroom remained untouched, her favorite stuffed rabbit still perched on the pillow, but the laughter that once filled those walls was gone. In its place existed only the echo of questions nobody could answer. By the termination of that summer, the media's interest began fading. The story that had dominated headlines was gradually displaced by newer tragedies. Candlelight vigils diminished in size, attendance dwindling as weeks stretched into months. Dana still attended each one, clutching the identical photograph of Lila in her rose-colored dress, her expression hollow. In the police department, the case file had grown voluminous, hundreds of pages of interviews, search warrants, and photographs. Detectives argued over theories late into the night. One maintained belief Lila had been accidentally killed and her body concealed nearby. Another thought she'd been abducted by a stranger who fled the state. But absent evidence, no remains, no witnesses, no forensic trail. There was minimal more they could execute. The investigation slowly hemorrhaged funding, manpower, and momentum. By spring of the following year, the Maple Hollow birthday disappearance was officially labeled a cold case. It was placed in a metal filing cabinet in the subterranean level of the county sheriff's office. One folder among hundreds of others marked with missing faces and faded names. For the Hartleys, life splintered permanently. Dana relocated with her sister for a temporal period, unable to bear the silence of the house. Tom liquidated his business and departed town altogether. They rarely communicated. What had once been a family bound by love was now bound exclusively by grief and unanswered questions. Yet for those who still inhabited that thoroughfare, the neighbors who'd watched the chaos unfold, there existed a sense that something had been missed, something obvious, concealed in plain sight. Richard Cole still inhabited the residence across the thoroughfare. His lawn was immaculate, his curtains perpetually drawn. He occasionally waved when he saw someone he recognized, but people no longer reciprocated. The man who had once assisted hanging birthday streamers was now treated like a specter among the living, quietly avoided, politely feared. Behind closed doors, residents whispered. Oh, they couldn't prove it, but many maintained belief the truth had been right there all along, sealed behind one of those neat white walls across the thoroughfare. And for years, that quiet unease, half suspicion, half denial, would settle over Maple Hollow like a fog that refused to lift. Nobody knew it then, but 15 years later, that fog was about to break. And when it did, the truth would prove more suffocating than the silence ever was. 15 years passed, but in Maple Hollow, temporal progression never genuinely moved forward. The cul-de-sac where the Hartleys once resided remained eerily unchanged, as though the day of Lila's birthday had been trapped in amber. The identical oak tree stood by the sidewalk, its bark carved with initials long since forgotten. The identical, quiet residences lined the thoroughfare, though most of the families who had once filled them with laughter were gone. New residents arrived and departed, drawn by the diminished property, values, but unaware of the shadow the neighborhood carried. Locals still lowered their voices when mentioning the birthday party house. By 2024, Maple Hollow had become a place people passed through, not a place they inhabited. The few who'd lived there long enough to remember that summer of 2009 described it like a wound that never closed. Not bleeding anymore, but never quite healed either. The Hartley residence had changed ownership 3 times. Each family repainted the walls, remodeled the kitchen, replaced the rear fence. But beneath it all, something unspoken lingered. People claimed they felt uneasy there, though nobody could explain why. Across the years, Dana attempted to rebuild what life would allow. The inaugural few years were the most arduous. Her mornings commenced with the identical ache, that moment between unconsciousness and waking when she'd still anticipate hearing Lia's footsteps in the hallway. When reality set in, she'd sit on the edge of the bed, staring at the framed school photograph on her dresser, her daughter's smile frozen in innocence. Eventually, Dana found purpose in the pain. She began volunteering for missing children organizations, at first quietly, then publicly. By 2018, she was traveling across Tennessee to speak at community centers, churches, and educational institutions. She told her story not as a plea for sympathy, but as a warning that something like this could happen anywhere, to anyone. She spoke with the steady calm of someone who had made peace with uncertainty, but those closest to her knew she hadn't. Every year on June 13th, she returned to Maple Hollow. She parked her automobile on the identical thoroughfare, walked to the fence line where the search dogs had last detected Lia's scent, and tethered a bundle of rose-colored balloons to the post. Neighbors who still remembered her would emerge from their porches to watch from their porches, uncertain whether to approach. Dana never remained long. She would stand there for several minutes, whisper something nobody could hear, then drive away. Elsewhere, Detective Mary Ann Lell had retired years ago, though the word retired never fit her well. She had been the lead investigator on Lia's case, sharp, methodical, and relentless, but time had worn her down in ways nobody could see. The case had haunted her more than any she'd ever worked. She kept the original file in her home office, a thick binder of reports, statements, and photos. She'd told herself she held onto it because one day there might be a break, a new lead. But in truth, she couldn't let go because it had become part of her. The file sat on her desk like a scar she couldn't stop tracing. Some nights she would pour a glass of bourbon, open the folder, and study the same details she'd memorized years ago. The timestamps, the maps, the photograph of the fence line where the scent stopped. She still wondered what they'd missed. She'd gone back to that neighborhood more times than she could count, walking the route herself, imagining what an 8-year-old might have seen, might have heard. Every time she left, she felt the same chill of defeat. The town's younger residents barely remembered the story. To them, it was something their parents mentioned when warning them to stay close to home. The phrase, "that birthday girl," had become almost mythic, an echo of tragedy more than a memory of a real child. The few remaining neighbors avoided discussing it at all. For them, forgetting was a kind of survival. Then, one night in the spring of 2024, Maple Hollow stirred again. Just after midnight, the county 911 dispatch center received a call from a nursing facility on the outskirts of town. The line was faint, the voice trembling and low, almost a whisper. The caller identified himself as Richard Cole, age 72, the same man who had once lived across the thoroughfare from the Hartleys. The operator asked him what the emergency was. His answer was nearly swallowed by the sound of oxygen hiss and static. "I can't carry it anymore," he said. "I know what happened to that birthday girl." The dispatcher froze. The phrase was unmistakable. That birthday girl. It was the same one used by locals when they spoke of the case, the same one the media had used 15 years ago. When the operator asked him to repeat it, his voice broke. "The little girl, the one from Maple Hollow. I need to tell someone before I go." Then the line went dead. Within an hour, officers were dispatched to the nursing facility. They found Richard Cole sitting upright in his bed, trembling. His eyes were red, his breathing shallow. When they asked what he meant, he told them he'd been seeing her face for months. In his sleep, in the hallway reflections, even in the window glass. He said it wasn't right to keep it inside any longer. The attending nurse told detectives he'd been growing increasingly agitated over the past week. He'd refused medication, claiming he didn't want to die with lies in his lungs. His medical records showed advanced lung disease. Doctors didn't expect him to live much longer. When word of the call reached Detective Lell the next morning, she sat motionless for several minutes before speaking. She was 70 now, slower, fragile, but her mind was still sharp. The voice on the tape was unmistakable. Richard Cole, the man she'd quietly suspected but could never prove guilty, had finally said something that sounded like a confession. She drove to the precinct, her old badge hanging from the rearview mirror, the case file sitting on the passenger seat beside her. She hadn't been there in years, but walking through those doors felt like stepping back into the heat of that summer in 2009. At the same time, Dana Hartley was at home in Nashville when her phone began ringing nonstop. The first call came from a local reporter, the second from an old friend in Maple Hollow, the third from a detective she hadn't heard from in over a decade. All of them said the same thing. A man had come forward claiming to know what happened to Lila. She didn't say anything at first, just sat on the edge of her bed, her hand gripping the phone, the sound of her own heartbeat filling her ears. For 15 years, Dana had imagined this moment countless times. A phone call, a lead, a confession. In her mind, she'd prepared herself for it. But when it finally came, she realized there was no way to prepare for hope returning after so long buried. That night, Maple Hollow was no longer silent. News vans rolled back down the old cul-de-sac, headlights sweeping over the cracked pavement, illuminating a neighborhood that thought it had escaped its ghosts. Reporters gathered near the fence where the balloons used to be, where the trail had ended. And inside a dim hospital room, across town, a frail old man whispered the words that would shatter 15 years of quiet and reopen a wound that never healed. "I didn't mean for it to happen." It was the first time anyone had heard the truth spoken out loud. But it wouldn't be the last, because in Maple Hollow, the truth didn't come like lightning. It came like rot, slow, suffocating, and impossible to ignore once it surfaced. Every case here takes weeks of digging, verifying, and piecing together real lives that were lost. These stories matter. Someone out there still deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth, please like, subscribe, and share which part of today's case hit you the hardest. Your support keeps us going. Watch more solved cold cases in the description below. Now, let's get back to the case. When detectives entered Richard Cole's room at the Maple Hollow Care Center, the first thing they noticed was the sound, the faint, rhythmic hiss of oxygen pushing through a clear plastic tube. The room smelled of antiseptic and old air. Richard sat propped up against his pillows, a thin blanket pulled to his chest, his breathing shallow but steady. His hands trembled as he reached for the cup of water on his bedside table, the IV line on his wrist twitching with each movement. He looked nothing like the man they remembered from the old case photos. the neighbor who once helped hang balloons for a little girl's birthday party. Time had stripped him of that image, leaving only a fragile shell. Detectives Marianne Lell and James Clean stood at the edge of the room, unsure how to begin. It wasn't often that a man called 911 to confess to one of the most haunting unsolved cases in the county's history. They had replayed his words over and over before coming. "I can't carry it anymore. I know what happened to that birthday girl." Lell took a step closer. Richard's eyes were sunken but alert, scanning their faces with a strange mix of relief and dread. When he finally spoke, his voice rasped like sandpaper. "I don't have long," he said. "I just want to leave clean." He told them that on the day of Lila Hartley's 8th birthday, he'd been sitting on his porch when he saw her chasing a balloon that had slipped free from the party. It drifted across the yard and over his fence, bouncing gently in the summer breeze. He called out to her, told her he'd help her find it. According to him, she followed him into his garage, trusting him the way children trusted familiar adults. He said he remembered turning his back for a second, just a second, to look for the balloon. And when he turned around, she was on the floor. She wasn't moving. He claimed she'd fallen and hit her head on a metal tool near his workbench. His hands trembled as he tried to demonstrate, tracing an invisible spot on his temple. His voice cracked as he described kneeling beside her, shaking her shoulder, calling her name. He said there was blood. Not much, but enough to know something was terribly wrong. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he kept saying. "It was an accident." The detectives didn't interrupt. They just listened, their notepads untouched. After 15 years of silence, the story they had been chasing was spilling out in fragments, confused, hesitant, but terrifyingly plausible. Richard told them he panicked. He didn't call 911. Instead, he said he wrapped Lila's body in an old tarp from his shed, waited until dark, and took her to the creek. His breathing quickened as he said it, the words collapsing into each other. He said he carried her in the trunk of his car, parked near the old service road by the woods, and left her by the water, weighted with rocks. He said he couldn't remember exactly where, just somewhere near the bend where the creek split into two narrow channels. When Lale asked why he'd never spoken up, his answer was barely audible. "Because I told myself it wasn't my fault," he whispered. "But she's been in my dreams ever since. I see her every night, standing by that fence, holding that pink balloon." He began to cry, deep, shaking sobs that sent his oxygen mask sliding down his face. The detectives exchanged a glance. They had heard false confessions before, but something in his trembling detail, the way he remembered the smallest things, the color of the balloon, the sound of her sandals on the pavement, made it feel disturbingly real. They left the room just after sunrise, the recording device still running in Lel's coat pocket. By the time they stepped into the morning light, both detectives were quiet, the weight of the confession pressing down on them. Within hours, search teams were mobilized. County deputies, forensic technicians, and divers spread out along the creek Richard had described. It was the same creek that wound behind the old service road, about 2 miles from Maple Hollow. The terrain was overgrown, thick with brush and vines. Excavators began digging in the areas marked on the map Richard drew shakily from his bed. But nothing appeared. No tarp, no clothing, no bones. For 2 days, teams scoured the area. Cadaver dogs were brought in, but their alerts were inconsistent. Rain from earlier in the week had turned the ground to mud, erasing whatever trace might have once existed. On the 3rd day, the search was suspended. The sheriff stood before reporters and said they were working to corroborate the suspect's statements. Behind the calm tone, frustration was setting in. If Richard Cole was telling the truth, they had no evidence to prove it, and if he was lying, The question was why. When Lel and Cleany returned to the nursing home for a follow-up interview, Richard's condition had worsened. His voice was thinner now, his words harder to catch. He said he wanted to make it right. But when they pressed for more specifics, landmarks, details, anything, his answers shifted. One minute he insisted it was near the bridge. The next he swore it was by the trailhead. He mentioned a second person at one point, his brother, long deceased, but then denied it moments later. The story began to unravel. Lel left the room with her stomach in knots. After 15 years, she had finally heard the words she'd been waiting for. But now she wasn't sure they meant anything at all. She'd spent her career chasing truth. And here, on the verge of finding it, the truth itself was slipping through her fingers. News of the confession spread fast. By the following evening, the story was everywhere, again. Neighbor confesses in Maple Hollow disappearance. The small Tennessee town that had learned to live in silence was suddenly thrown back into the spotlight. Old wounds reopened. Talk shows debated whether the confession was credible. Some residents claimed they had always known it was him. Others said it didn't make sense, that no one could keep something like that hidden for so long without leaving a trace. Lila Hartley watched the coverage from her living room, her hands shaking as she clutched the remote. She'd waited 15 years for closure, but now every word from Richard Cole's confession made her skin crawl. She didn't want to believe her daughter's last moments had happened just a few yards from their home, but she couldn't ignore the possibility. The thought of that garage, the same one she had seen every day out her kitchen window, made her feel sick. She drove back to Maple Hollow 2 days later, standing again at the fence line where it had all begun. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying the faint sound of a church bell from down the road. For the first time, she didn't bring balloons. She just stood there, looking across the street at the house that had been Richard Cole's. The windows were boarded up now, the lawn overgrown. But behind those walls, she realized, might have been the last place her daughter ever breathed. Meanwhile, police continued to search for verification. They sent soil samples from the creek to the state crime lab. They subpoenaed property records, hoping to trace any changes to the land. But everything came back, clean. No evidence of decomposition, no signs of disturbance. Richard's story was crumbling under the weight of its own uncertainty. Some detectives began to question whether it had ever happened at all. Terminal illness sometimes brought hallucinations, confusion, even guilt over things never done. Was this one man's delusion, or was it the first flicker of truth finally surfacing after years of silence? By the time investigators returned for a final interview, Richard was barely conscious. He drifted in and out of sleep, mumbling fragments that no one could piece together. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he kept saying. "She just wouldn't wake up." He never signed a formal statement. 2 days later, his condition worsened and he was placed on hospice care. The doctors didn't expect him to last through the week. Outside the nursing home, a crowd of reporters had gathered. Camera lights reflected off the windows as locals watched from the sidewalk, trying to read the faces of the officers who came and went. The story that had haunted the town for more than a decade had returned, not with answers, but with more questions than ever. Detective Lel stood by her car, staring at the horizon. She had chased this case for half her life. Now, with the man she'd always suspected lying on his deathbed, she still didn't know if she'd finally found the truth, or another dead end disguised as confession. Inside the facility, Richard Cole slept under a thin blanket, his oxygen machine humming softly. He would never see the chaos outside. He would never know that his words, true or not, had cracked open a silence that Maple Hollow had spent 15 years trying to forget. And as the night fell over the town once again, one question echoed louder than all the rest. If he was lying, why did his story fit so perfectly into the place where Lila's trail had ended? The next morning, detectives would return to that neighborhood one last time, back to the same garage that had stood untouched since 2009, and what they'd find there would change everything they thought they knew about the case. Because sometimes the truth doesn't hide in the woods or at the bottom of a creek. Sometimes it's buried right where you've been standing all along, under concrete, under lies, under 15 years of silence. 2 days after Richard Cole's confession, detectives returned to Maple Hollow for what they believed would be their final sweep. The creek search had failed, and without physical evidence, the confession felt hollow. Another story built on guilt and fading memory. But something about Cole's words kept gnawing at Detective Mary Ann Lell. The way he described the balloon, the mention of the tarp, the shifting details about his brother. None of it fully aligned. And yet when she looked at the old photographs of the Hartley home, at the fence where the scent trail had ended, her instinct screamed that the answer was still somewhere close. So, the team went back, to the beginning, to the place that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The Cole property hadn't been touched in years. The house was vacant, its windows clouded with dust, the lawn overtaken by weeds. Inside, the air was stale, the smell of mildew heavy in the dark. In the garage, old stains marked the concrete floor where Richard used to keep his workbench. It was there that detectives noticed something odd. A patch of newer cement near the back corner, slightly lighter in color with faint circular marks as if from an old drum or bucket. According to property records, the floor had been resurfaced in 2010, less than a year after Lila disappeared. Lell requested a ground-penetrating radar scan. It was a long shot, the kind of request that usually went nowhere after so many years. But the sheriff signed off, and within 48 hours, forensic specialists rolled in with the equipment. They dragged the antenna across the garage floor, scanning inch by inch. At first, the screen showed nothing unusual, just layers of compacted soil and concrete. Then, near the back corner, a small anomaly appeared. It was no bigger than a shoebox, but distinct, a void space where there shouldn't have been one. They ran the scan twice more. The same irregular shape appeared each time. By dawn the next morning, a team of technicians began breaking through the slab. The sound of drills and chisels echoed down the empty street, watched quietly by a few remaining neighbors who had come out, knowing something was happening again in Maple Hollow. It took nearly 4 hours to reach the cavity. When they finally did, the smell of damp soil rose through the crack. Inside the small hollow space, wrapped in what remained of a torn plastic tarp, they found a cluster of items. Rusted nails, fragments of old wood, and something else, a piece of fabric. Then, just beside it, a partial shoe sole, small enough to belong to a child.